Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of The Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Mélusine Boon-Falleur. She is a PhD student in cognitive sciences at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, researching how evolution shaped our brain. She is particularly interested in studying how individuals adapt to the amount of resources available in their environment and how our social cognition influences pro-environmental behavior. And we're going to focus on those topics today. So, Mélusine, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Hi, Ricardo. Thank you for inviting me to the show. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So, before getting into how people deal with resources or how they adapt their behavior to different amounts of resources, let's say, let me ask you first about another topic you've done work on. So, what are non-cognitive skills?
Sure. So this was my first research project in my PhD was around these so-called non-cognitive skills, which are often also called socio-emotional skills or simply emotional skills, etc. And basically, they refer to all of these capacities that we have that are not directly linked to intelligence. Let's say they're separate from the IQ. And so they can be everything from people's ability to regulate their behavior, from their extroversion, their self-control, their conscientiousness, etc. And these skills have been shown to be very important for many behavioral outcomes, many life outcomes, such as academic achievement, professional achievement, or health, criminality, etc.
So, and in terms of academic achievement, because in on the show I've already talked several times with people who do research on IQ and cognitive ability, for example. But since we're talking here about non-cognitive skills, what role do they play in academic achievement?
Yes, so obviously we all know that cognitive skills like your spatial reasoning abilities, your math abilities are very important for success at school. But what we're starting to see is that to be a successful student, you not only need to be able to read and write and solve math problems, etc., you also need to be able to regulate your behavior. And so if you're able to persist through difficulties, if you're able to follow someone's instructions really well, you're going to do better at school. So there's been an increasing number of studies looking at the role of these non-cognitive skills, in particular the role of conscientiousness, which is the desire to do a task well, of self-control, which is the ability to regulate behavior, attention and emotions in the service of valued goals, and grit, the ability to persevere towards long-term goals. And so researchers have looked at these three non-cognitive skills and shown that if you do an external intervention to increase the skills, you will improve the outcomes of students at school. And so because of this growing literature on these non-cognitive skills, there's been more and more attention brought to these. And so you have international programs to try to develop these skills in schools. The OECD has an entire task force around socio-emotional skills. So they're increasingly important in the literature.
By the way, conscientiousness, in this case, it refers to the big five personality trait, or not?
Indeed. So conscientiousness is one of the big five in the ocean model. And self-control and grit can be seen as like subscales of this conscientiousness trait. They're usually very correlated among them.
And can they all be measured? I mean, conscientiousness, I know it can be measured, and I know how because I've already interviewed personality psychologists on the show who do work on that specifically. But what about self-control and grit?
Sure. So the kind of more widespread way to measure these skills is to ask people to fill the self-reported questionnaire. So obviously you must be familiar with the Big Five questionnaire, and so you have a number of questions centered around conscientiousness. And these questionnaires usually have pretty good reliability. And so similar questionnaires have been developed to measure self-control and grit. But this is not the only way we can measure these skills. And of course, self-reported questionnaires can be can have a number of problems to measure these aptitudes because they're subject to desirability bias, whereby especially if you ask students in school to talk about themselves, they might try to showcase themselves in the best light possible. You can have some reference points bias, where if you're in a class with only really, really good students, you might rate yourself as pretty low in conscientiousness because you're comparing yourself to others. Whereas if you're in a class where the students are not that conscientious, don't have a lot of self-control, you might rate yourself higher because it depends on your environment. And so you kind of have this reference points bias in these questionnaires. And so that's why the alternative ways to measure them, you also have third-party reported questionnaires. So this is something where you can ask another person to rate your behavior. So you can ask parents of students or teachers to evaluate this behavior. This, for the most part, takes rid of the desirability bias, although sometimes parents want to, put their kids in a favorable light, so they might not be the most honest people when you ask them. And there's definitely still the reference point bias. Obviously, when a teacher will evaluate a student, this he or she might have in their head the behavior of all the other students and use that as a reference group. And so it might be hard to compare ratings across different teachers because they have different reference points, different use. There's, for example, a famous study that showed that students in Korea systematically reported themselves as being lower in conscientiousness than other groups, for example, European students. And this was not correlated to any real behavioral outcome, and it might be something about reference points that led to this systematic difference in ratings between Korean students and European students. And so the third way to measure these non-cognitive skills or socio-emotional skills is through the so-called behavioral task. And so the idea here is to identify a behavior that's strongly correlated to the construct of interest, and to design a task that will measure this behavior, measure different outcomes, and use that as a proxy for measuring conscientiousness, self-control, or grit. And obviously behavioral tasks are often considered to be more objective because they don't rely on a subjective appraisal of someone. And so they're often valued in literature, but they can be a number of other biases that are specific to behavioral tasks, such as the fact that you're measuring only an instance of a behavior and not like the average of that behavior over the individual's life course or over a couple of weeks, etc.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, just to understand a little bit better how you look at the relationship between these different psychological entities or traits, so grit, conscientiousness, and self-control. I mean, because aren't they all correlated? I think you touched a little bit on this earlier, but I mean, someone who scores high on conscientiousness usually tends to have higher self-control and perhaps also grit, correct? Or do they vary independently from one another to some extent?
Yeah, so self-control and grit are supposed to be two different facets of conscientiousness.
Okay.
And so they're all going to be very correlated, but these are two like subdomains of conscientiousness.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I mean, talking about these non-cognitive or socio-emotional skills, because earlier I mentioned IQ and cognitive ability, general intelligence, let's say. I mean, do we know if one or the other type of trait plays a bigger role in academic achievement? That is, what do we know if the cognitive skills are more important than the non-cognitive ones or vice versa?
It can be, I think it depends on the type of outcome, of academic outcome that you're looking at. And often just looking at cognitive skills, just looking at IQ can predict a lot of the achievement of students. But it might be a little hard to disentangle the effects of strictly IQ versus cognitive versus socio-emotional skills. Because, for example, a student that's that has a lot of self-control or has a lot of grit will maybe do their homework better, pay more attention in class, which will in turn help the students develop better math skills or logic reasoning skills, etc. and so will increase their scores on IQ tests. And so it's a bit hard to disentangle what's the effect strictly of non-cognitive skills and what's the effect of socio-emotional skills, because one can influence the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's that idea that someone can be extremely intelligent, but if they are not conscientious, perhaps they won't really focus too much on their studies. And even though they have very high cognitive ability, they won't learn the materials because they don't want to do that. They don't want to dedicate themselves to doing that. Right.
Indeed. And the other way around, a student that might not have a very not start with a huge advantage in cognitive skills. If that student has is very conscientious, then he or she might be able to overcome initial difficulties and develop better language skills, better math skills, etc. So these are very important to work in conjunction.
So let's get now into your work on how people deal with resources and how they allocate resources. So in what ways do quantitative changes in resources lead to qualitative changes in people's priorities and psychology?
Sure. So maybe to give a bit of context around this strand of research. So
Yeah.
in my lab and for my PhD, I've been really interested in understanding the causal role of resources on people's personality traits, behavioral strategy, preferences, etc. And the idea is that we already know that different groups of people differ in their behavior, such as their time horizon, or who they trust, how they take care of their health, etc. We also know that there is a socioeconomic gradient to this behavior. Individuals with a low socioeconomic background who live or have lived in more deprived environments don't have the same behavior than individuals in a high socioeconomic, who have a high socioeconomic status and who are in more favorable environments. And so some of the literature in psychology has well studied this phenomena, has described these differences. And then some of the literature has looked at the causes of these differences. What factor leads to systemic differences between high SES individuals and low SES individuals? And so far in the literature, especially in the evolutionary psychology literature, but even in the cognitive science literature at large, the role of the main factor that has been studied has been mortality and differences in the mortality or morbidity in people's environment. And so kind of the narrative was that if you're in an environment with very high mortality, if you have a higher chance of dying, well, you should change your strategy. And this will lead to a number of psychological and behavioral differences. What we're doing here with this research is trying to look at another factor. So holding mortality risk constant, what is the direct impact of having resources? If you have, to put it even in its simplest form, if you have 10 euros or 1,000 euros, how is that going to affect your beliefs, your personality traits, your strategy, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Does that have anything to do with life history theory? Is that the framework you apply in your work or not?
Indeed. So what I was referring to earlier, so all this trend of literature that looks at differences between individuals, I think the main one has been, well, originally the RK literature has looked at differences across species in life history strategy. And then the life history theory literature has looked a lot at the impact of morbidity, of scarcity, or even of deprivation on people's strategy. But typically it has focused mainly on reproductive behavior and the quantity-quality trade-off, looking at how individuals invest their energy in their reproductive capabilities, when do they start reproducing, how many children do they have, what's the type of parental investment that they have, etc. And then from this original life history literature, there's been kind of like some some other strands that have developed from that, the life history literature in psychology, that kind of studied these behavioral or psychological differences between people, but they weren't based on the same models as a life history theory that really looks at biological parameters such as reproduction. And so what we're trying to do here is to say, well, yes, there are a lot of psychological differences, but these differences are not necessarily caused by differences in mortality. They're caused by differences in resources. And we developed a model to show like how the direct impact of resources, having many or having very little, can impact someone's behavior. And so, and this is also related to the pace of life syndrome, this literature that studies pace of life, but we're really trying to connect or fill the gap between biological models and the psychological level, to say that these psychology differences that we know about, that have been observed, they're not due to like a reproductive model or the typical life history model. They're really due to a direct impact of resources.
So you're focusing on the psychological impact of resources, I mean, just in terms of on a population level and also on an individual level, or?
So our model is really at the individual level.
Okay.
So the way we look at this is we start from the point that if variations in resources have been large enough in our evolutionary environment, then it must be the case, or it's likely to be the case, that we have developed adaptations to deal with different levels of resources, especially if the optimal behavior is not the same when you have very little resources or when you have many resources. And so from this, we have a model that shows that given that resources may be limited, and that you have to allocate these resources between different needs, you should always favor the need or like the investment that leads to the largest increase in fitness. So you should seek always the highest marginal benefit. And because most investment that you can make have diminishing marginal returns, well, at some point you should stop investing always in the same thing and switch to something new. Kind of the intuitive idea behind this is that imagine you have very little resources. Well, maybe the first thing you're going to do with them is get some water and some food. But as you become richer and richer, you're not going to drink 100 times more water. That wouldn't be a very smart investment, right? There's some diminishing marginal returns at some point. There's no positive impact of that extra unit of water or that extra unit of food. And so you're going to start doing something else with these resources. You're going to start maybe investing in a shelter, or investing in your social relationships, or investing in acquiring more knowledge, more skills, etc. And so the idea is, again, that as the amount of resources that we have access to grows, we're going to invest them differently, and we're going to start fulfilling different types of needs. And this can kind of lead to the empirically observed hierarchy of needs, or the pyramid of needs that was made popular by Maslow about over a century ago. And so this mechanism that allows us to allocate our resources in a way that's optimal, that will increase our fitness, this has a number of consequences at the psychological level, because your psychology to manage your resources optimally is not the same when you have very few resources than when you have many resources. And so this is what we show in our work. And especially we focus on a number of psychological parameters such as risk-taking, time discounting, and also the sorts of sense of agency or the influence that you can have over your environment.
But when it comes to that pyramid of needs you mentioned there, is it that, there's the pyramid starting with perhaps, I can't remember the exact steps of the Maslow pyramid here, I can't remember them exactly, but start with like self-sustaining stuff like food and water and ending up at self-actualization or something like that. Is it that as people get more and more resources, they go up the pyramid step by step, or, for example, it's not necessarily the case that they have to follow the pyramid from bottom to top. I mean, for example, if they have few resources, can they still, for example, pay more attention to stuff that is higher on the pyramid instead of just the self-sustenance stuff, let's say?
So I guess there's kind of several aspects to your question. I think that first of all
Okay.
is like, what is the succession of things? I feel like what we're pretty committed to is to say that there's a natural ordering
No.
of the needs that you should fulfill. Like
Okay.
if you're starving and then you get some resources, spending those resources reading a book is probably not going to be the optimal behavior to adopt. And we would all have this intuition, right? We'll be like, what are you doing? You should eat first. This is
Yeah.
kind of to give the intuition. It's a bit of a gimmicky example. And so the fact that that there is kind of a natural succession of needs that have to be fulfilled, this is an idea that we're pretty committed to, and this stems from these kind of diminishing marginal returns. And so at first you focus on the need that will, at a given time, give you the highest increase in fitness, let's say. It will have the highest positive impact, and then as this starts saturating, you will start diversifying your allocation and move away to new types of needs. So we're pretty committed to that structure. However, the exact succession of needs may depend on your environment. So imagine you live
Okay.
in a very, in an extremely cold environment. Building a shelter will probably be something absolutely vital to you. And so even if you have very little resources, you're going to allocate some of those resources to building a shelter, because if you don't, that will have a very large negative impact on you. So this will probably show up very early in your allocation of resources. Now imagine you're in a different environment where the temperature is very mild, there's not a lot of climatic incidents around you, then maybe building a shelter is not going to be very high on your priority. It's going to, or it's going to be, the other way around. It's going to be higher on your pyramid of needs. You're not going to fulfill that need right away because the fitness impact of fulfilling that need is going to be comparatively pretty small to other uses of those resources. So let's say that there is always going to be a natural ordering, a succession of different things that you can do with your resources, but then the environment will maybe condition what is more of a priority.
So the pyramid is not fixed, right?
No, it depends to your environment. There's probably some patterns that are the same everywhere. Like no matter where you are in the world, eating and drinking is going to be pretty high priority. But then some other needs are going to depend, and it can depend on, for example, the social structure that you're in. And so depending on the maybe on the sex ratio or on the structure of the mating market, investing in your status is not going to have the same return. And so you might find places where investing in your status and in signaling is going to be very important, where other places is not going to be as important.
Yeah, I asked you that because I was thinking about Maslow's pyramid of needs, and I'm not sure, of course, if he eventually changed his mind across his life or not about its structure. But as far as I know, it seems that he had an idea that it was sort of fixed. Right.
Indeed. Yeah. And I think that in the broad strokes, he was probably right about what is more urgent and more important, and what is more something that people can afford once the rest is already taken care of. But again, the specific depends on people's ecology.
So perhaps give us some examples of aspects of people's decision making that are influenced by the allocation of the resources that they have available. Like, for example, it influences their parenting style, right? And cooperation, health, and other aspects like that. So give us perhaps 2 or 3 examples of that.
Sure. So I'll start with that. I'll start by explaining kind of how the allocation of resources affect people's time horizon.
Okay.
And so here I'll try to give like a more intuitive example of how this can work. So imagine that you have little resources. For example, you currently don't have a house, you don't have a place to sleep, and you're faced with the choice of either getting a small house, not so great right now, or waiting a year to get a better house. But currently your state is that you have no house. Well, because you're in the state where your resources are already low, the marginal benefit of getting a house, even if it's a small house, is not that great. Maybe there's a lot of leaks or whatever in the house. Well, the marginal impact is still going to be really big because currently your state is no house. And so in this trade-off, you might decide to be more impatient in the way that you will accept a smaller house earlier rather than a larger house later in time. Okay, so that's one situation. Now imagine another situation where you're faced with the same choice, having a smaller house immediately or a larger house a year from now, but now you already have a house, you already have a place to stay. Because you have more resources, these needs are already fulfilled, you can afford to delay getting a shelter because that's not going to have a huge impact on your fitness. You already have something to protect yourself. And so you're going to display a behavior that's more patient. You can afford to wait a longer time. So you're going to opt for that. And this would translate into differences in people's time horizon or in the patients measured empirically, different experiments. And so the idea behind this is that the amount of resources you have should kind of calibrate your degree of patience. If you have very little resources, you probably have a good use for anything you can get, and you should try to get it right away and put it to work because that's going to have an immediate impact and you can use these resources to increase your productivity, everything like that. If you already have a lot of resources, well, maybe you don't need them immediately. You can afford to be more patient, you can afford to wait a little longer, get a little better, etc. And so one of the many domains where this will have a consequence is, for example, on cooperation. Mm-hmm. So if you have more resources, you can afford to cooperate in settings where you might not get a benefit right away from this interaction. This may happen more in the long term, over a longer period of time. And so maybe you can afford to cooperate in this more like indirect form of cooperation, the kind of indirect type of cooperation that we see in democracies, the kind of cooperation you do with strangers, for example, social security. Social security is a form of like very long-term cooperation where you're contributing, you're cooperating every month, or you're giving something every month, and then maybe in the longer term you will get a benefit in exchange the day where you will need something. And so this can kind of explain differences in pattern of trust and cooperation that we see in society. At the other end of the spectrum, if you have very little resources, you might have to be a more cautious cooperator. You might not be able to afford to, invest in someone or invest in an interaction where you won't see the benefit right away, because you need those benefits right now. You have some stuff to do with these resources right away, and so you might only prefer interactions where it's a more immediate exchange and where there's not this like longer term component for it. Mm-hmm. So that was one aspect, cooperation. Another aspect can be the impact on health. So for example, every day you have to decide whether you will invest in your health, and a lot of health investments come at an immediate cost for benefits that spread over the future. For example, if I brush my teeth, that's going to take me a little bit of time, a little bit of resources, and the benefit is only going to accrue over the long term because I'll have better dentition, I'll be less likely to have a disease, like to have some toothaches in the long term, etc. And so if I already have a lot of resources, that might be a sound investment. Like there's nothing else I should be doing with these resources. I can afford to pay that cost to make this long-term investment. Whereas if I'm starving, if I'm like, you would be very surprised to see someone starving but brushing their teeth every day. You'd be like, what are you doing? This is a very illogical thing to do. And so this has an impact in for many health behaviors, because you see this tension between immediate cost for long-term benefits that can only be afforded by people who already have a lot of resources.
And I mean, I guess that this is very important for people to understand, because particularly in our post-industrial societies, we tend to put a lot of value on thinking long-term planning and all of that. But for people who live in or have a low socioeconomic status, I mean, some of these things that people that are like middle class or upper class take for granted, I mean, they might not make sense, and sometimes we are a little bit, it's really easy for us to be or to moralize people's behavior and say, oh, you're not planning ahead, you're wasting the few resources you have on this or that, and I mean, all of that kind of stuff, right? And in the context that some people live in, it's actually rational for them to have a shorter time horizon. Right.
Indeed, that's why you kind of pinpointed to that concept exactly. Is something that I really love using and talking to my students about, is this idea of contextually rational behavior. And so indeed, we often, when we look at social issues like health investment or even the environment, ecology, we tend to blame a lot of people, being like, oh, you don't have enough self-control, or you don't have enough, you're not responsible enough, you're violent, etc. And we blame them. We have this kind of intuitive model that it's something that's the problem of the individual, and that their behavior is irrational. Maybe they're borrowing money at a very high interest rate, and we're like, that makes no sense, that's too expensive. But then if you take a different approach and you look at the context of the individual, something that appears irrational at first sight might make a lot of sense in the broader context. It's a bit like if you see someone jumping out the window, you'd be like, wow, this is very irrational behavior. But then you turn around and you see that the building was on fire. Then, well, that behavior all of a sudden makes much more sense. And so I feel that when we deal with issues of wealth and poverty, we often only look at the individual and we forget the broader picture, which is the context. The building is on fire for a lot of people, which may push them to adopt certain behaviors that actually make a lot of sense and are not the thing that we should move. And so if you want, I think this is also important for the type of policies that we seek to put in place, for the type of responses to certain behaviors that we want to do. So in the same way, if you want people to not jump out of window, well, you could do a whole lot of programs to tell them, well, jumping out the window is really bad, it's dangerous for your health, you should not be doing it. You could try to put some bars on the window, etc. Or you can make sure that there's no fire in the building. And so I feel that this is where we have, as cognitive scientists, and especially as behavioral ecologists that are really studying this relationship between people's environment and their behavior, their personality traits, we have a lot of work to be doing in that space to say, like, let's focus our attention on the context, on the factors in the environment that's shaping this behavior. And let's try to focus the solutions on that, because rewiring people's brain is pretty hard. Trying to change someone's personality trait and behavioral strategy, that's pretty hard. But maybe we can change the context. And so give people resources when they need them. And that's probably going to be more effective to affect their behavior.
Also, because even if we take into account certain, I don't know, individual factors that might play a role here, and of course, I think we shouldn't expect that 100% of people that are low in socioeconomic status would have short time horizons. I mean, this is always statistical, right? But I mean, but still, even for people that would be perhaps, I don't know, more conscientious or something like that, and think more in the long term or plan far more ahead, let's say, I mean, if they have very little resources, I mean, we shouldn't expect them to really, even if they have those personality traits, to for it to change that much their circumstances, because they can't do much with what they have, right?
Indeed, indeed. And I think that in some way, there's this whole almost like an ethical dilemma when we're working on public policy and trying to understand people's behavior. It's like, well, maybe we want to push people to invest more in their health and be more careful and eat healthier and exercise and not smoke, etc. But at the same time, if these people don't have a very long life expectancy, don't have a lot of resources, maybe we're nudging them in a direction that like is not always contextually adaptive for these people. And so I think that this is kind of reframing behavior in this relationship between individual and their environment, kind of asks more productive question as like, what's the best target for our policy?
Right. So, and does that link in any way to risky or risk-taking behaviors as well?
Yeah, so I think that risk is one of these concepts that means very different thing depending on who you ask. So I come before doing my PhD in cognitive science, I did a master's in economics. So for me, risk has this kind of very clear definition, which is just linked to the variance of outcomes. So it's like, would you like $50 or 50 euros for sure, or a 50% chance of getting 100 euros? Well, if you choose the second option, the 50% chance, then you're more risk seeking than if you chose a sure option. That for me is what risk means. For other people, when you talk about risk, they'll think about risky behaviors such as unprotected sex or risky health behaviors like smoking or speeding, not wearing a helmet, etc. And so often the whole literature on risk kind of bundles together very different concepts. And so this can lead to different predictions depending on what type of risk you're talking about. And so if you take the perspective of like risk as variance, so really kind of this lottery framework, what we're saying is that as you have more and more resources, you can afford to take on larger and larger amounts of risk. For example, if you have 10 euros, you can probably gamble 1 euro and you'll be fine. If you have 1,000 euros, you can probably gamble 100 euros and you'll still be fine. So the absolute amount of risk that you can take is going to get bigger and bigger. It's kind of, which is a very uncontroversial finding. There's some evidence for that as we have more resources, we tend to allocate more and more of those towards risky outcomes. And so if we have this perspective, we can make this prediction with the caveat that if you're in a very, very poor environment, in a very resource-low environment, you might be below what certain scientists have called a desperation threshold, where you're willing to like risk everything just because you're about to die anyway, or you're about to be in such a bad situation anyway that you might as well kind of go all in and risk it. And so we make the prediction that as you have more resources, you start taking more and more risk in terms of variance. This goes in contrast with the psychology literature on risk that looks at risk more as it's like risky behaviors, health behaviors, which predicts that the fewer resources you have, the more risk you'll take. So maybe you'll smoke more, you'll engage in riskier health behavior, etc. But for us, this is from a very different phenomenon. This has more to do with the time horizon, what I explained earlier. Where it's like, it's not worth making that investment now. It's not worth brushing your teeth. It's not worth not smoking. The immediate benefit of smoking that you have right now is just more important than the long-term costs.
And I mean, but there are different types of risks, right? Because, for example, we have hazards like smoking, speeding, drinking, risky sexual behavior, but we also have risks like innovation, financial risks, being an entrepreneur, and all of that, right? So, psychologically speaking, does it make sense to separate these kinds of risks into two different categories?
Yeah, this is what we argued in the paper with Jean-Baptiste André and Nicolas Baumard, where we say that when we look at risk, again, we pile a lot of different behaviors together, but we think that one important dimension is time.
Yeah.
And so that's why on one hand, we have these behaviors that we call hazardous behaviors, where basically you have a short-term benefit for a long-term cost. So smoking would be one of those. You have a short-term benefit, a long-term health cost. Maybe speeding, etc., is the same. You have a short-term benefit, maybe in terms of all the time saved, or maybe in reputation because you look a bit more attractive to some people, and then you might have a long-term cost, which is if you're in a car accident and you lose a leg or something like that, this will be a cost every day of your future life. And so that is one class of behavior, this hazardous risk. And then you have another class of risky behaviors, what we call venture behaviors, where it's the other way around. It's immediate cost for potential long-term benefit. And so here you have to be long-term oriented to be willing to take these, because it will cost you right away. If you become an entrepreneur, you might forego a lot of income, or you might renounce to some very important economic opportunities. Or if you adopt a new technology, well, there might be some immediate switching costs or some new income you need to spend, etc. But there might be a long-term benefit. If you become an entrepreneur and you're very successful, well, in the long term, this will be a benefit. If you adopt a new technology, this, although it may be costly at first, maybe in the long term, it will increase your productivity, etc. And so this is why we like to separate these things, because we don't have the same predictions on who will take what type of risk.
Yes, and I mean, earlier you mentioned the thing that I'm not sure if what I'm about to say makes sense about it or not, but please tell me. But you mentioned at a certain point in my previous question that something along the lines of as people have more and more money, they tend to allocate more of it to risky behaviors, right? So it was something like that. So I was just thinking that in terms of entrepreneurship, for example, and venture capitalism and all of that, I mean, people who create their own companies, for example, sometimes the ones that are successful tend to moralize other people, people who have less money, and say, oh, I've risked my own money, you're not doing that, and that's why you're not reaping the benefits as I am, and all of that. But I mean, perhaps the reason why I'm bringing that up is, so if I need, I don't know, 10,000 euros to start a small company, and that's all the money I have. I mean, I have money to eat and all of that to fulfill my basic needs with no issue at all, but that's the money I have. But if someone has like €1,000,000, and I mean, it's very easy for them to pick 10,000 euros of those €1,000,000 and invest in a small company to try to for it to have success and then to grow it and so on. So what I'm trying to say here is that perhaps sometimes people don't understand that people who are very close to the limit in terms of the money that it's necessary to start a business. I mean, it wouldn't make sense for them to risk their entire savings to do that, right? In comparing to people who have, even if they lose those 10,000 euros, I mean, probably it doesn't make much of a difference in their lives, right?
Indeed, that's exactly the right intuition, where the same amount of resources is going to represent very different costs and benefits for different people. If you have no money, 10,000 euros is going to have a very big impact on your livelihood and your reproductive success, etc. If you have a lot of money, those exact same amount of resources is just not going to have quite the same impact. And so we should take that into account, and people take that into account when they make decisions about what the optimal behavior to adopt. And here, I'll just make this point here is that we often talk about money or income just because in modern industrial society, this is very convenient. We're all used to using money and it's very fungible. We can make comparison across many different domains, but obviously it's not the only type of resources that we use. And this is the same phenomenon is true for any type of resource units that you decide to look into.
Right. So, but when it comes to the more hazardous behaviors like smoking, do you think that this kind of research can help us develop new strategies or approaches to prevent these sort of more hazardous behaviors?
Sure. I feel like the first and most obvious takeaway from this approach or contribution from this approach is simply that if you want people to change their behavior, just give them resources, give them do a direct cash transfer. It has been more and more popular in economics, where today people are supporting more cash transfers approach rather than educational approaches, etc. This is not to say that education programs never work. Sometimes there is information deficit about people, but in a lot of domains, we've seen time and time again that just like telling people about the risks of a behavior, telling people about the risks of smoking will not have a huge impact. And so what we're advocating is that for a lot of situations, information-only campaigns are not going to have a lot of impact, but a better way to allocate our resources as public policy individual is to allocate them towards direct cash transfers. Just give people some resources and they will know what's best to do with them. And there's been a few research. It's like, obviously it's hard to externally manipulate people's amount of resources for obvious ethical reason. You're never going to take away resources for people for the purpose of research. And well, you need a lot of money to do a positive shock on people's income. But a few places where this has occurred, either through like randomized control trial or for more like natural reasons, like natural experiments, we have seen that these cash transfers can and often do have an impact on people's psychology and an impact on people's behavior with a reduction in hazardous behavior.
And this is very interesting because sometimes in political discussions and when talking, for example, about economic redistribution, people, particularly on the right, bring arguments to the table like, for example, oh, I don't want to pay more taxes or to have my money redistributed to poor people because it will only be financing their bad habits or something like that. But in fact, in this case, it could be the opposite. It might be easier for them to drop those quote-unquote bad habits. And also, if we're talking about health issues, I mean, we might even be preventing later higher costs in terms of dealing with health issues that they develop in the longer term. Right?
Indeed, and I think this is a phenomenon that I find very interesting. Is what are our stereotypes on other people who have different amount of resources? And there's actually, I'm currently running a study on this, so on these wealth-related stereotypes. So if you see someone with very little income or very high income, what are your immediate impressions about that individual? And so I think what you were saying is very true, is that often when we think about redistribution, obviously you've done, I think, quite a few episodes about our sense of morality and fairness. We're willing to redistribute only if we have the intuition that the person is deserving. And so often that means that they're hardworking, that I'm not just transferring my money to someone who's very lazy. I'm transferring money to someone who's hardworking and who deserves that money. And so if we have this kind of model that people's behavior is caused by like something that's within them, that's like a psychological trait rather than their circumstances, will be like, well, I don't want to redistribute money. I'm just going to sponsor this person's smoking habit or this drinking habit, etc. But if you start having a model where you understand, well, this behavior might be caused by the circumstances, and I'm going to change this person's circumstances, then you're more willing to redistribute. And so I think it's interesting, is like, why do we have a hard time imagining that if you give resources to people, if you give them money, they're going to change their psychology and behavior? Why do we not think about that? I don't have the answer. This is actually a research project we've discussed about doing in my lab. But this kind of like third-party reasoning, where you're like, oh, like, you imagine that they have this other fixed psychology. You probably wouldn't apply this reasoning to yourself. We have the intuition that if we're in a bad state and someone gives us help, we're going to change our behavior, but we just don't really apply that to other people.
Yeah, this sort of reminds me of the role that culture might also play here in terms of how people develop their stereotypes about people who are low socioeconomic status, or even in the extreme case, homeless. Because I was remembering a paper that I think was authored by Lida Cosmides and Michael Bank-Peterson. They compared Denmark to the US in terms of the stereotypes people have about, I think in that specific case it was homeless people, but I might be wrong about it. But basically in the US they are predominantly of the belief that if someone is homeless, it's because of bad decisions they made, and so they are responsible for it. And in Denmark they think that it's probably the result of bad luck, bad circumstances, and so they are more willing to support social programs and all of that in comparison to the US. So, I mean, perhaps that would be relevant
Yeah,
here.
I think that's a great paper, the Crowding Out Culture paper by Michael Bank-Peterson and Leda Cosmides and others. I think that's a really good example of how our intuition about people and the reasons are about their mental state, basically, or their psychological trait. Are they lazy or are they unlucky? Kind of to
Yeah.
put it in the earliest form. Well,
Yeah.
that's going to affect our willingness to redistribute. However, on the role of culture, obviously there's some cultural or historical contingencies that affect whether in one country low SES people will be perceived as more unlucky, and why in other countries low SES people might be perceived as more lazy. So there are some kind of idiosyncrasies in there that lead to societal level differences on our stereotypes. But
Yeah.
at the same time, what I've seen with my research, which was really surprising and interesting, was that a lot of these stereotypes about wealth and poverty are kind of universal. So to give you some context, in the study, what we did was that, so we were interested in studying people's stereotypes linked to poverty and wealth. But we
Okay.
were worried, we're like, if we ask you directly, like, to caricature a little bit, like, here's a poor person, do you think they're trustworthy? We obviously didn't want to ask the question like this, because that would lead to a lot of social desirability bias, et cetera, et cetera. So
Right.
what we did instead is that we used images from the Dollar Street database. This is an online database where you have images of households from all over the world. So
Oh,
you
is that from Gapminder?
Yeah, exactly. It's from the Gapminder Foundation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you have these great images of people's household, from their like toothbrush to their bathrooms to their dining rooms, etc., from all over the world, and within a country, from poor households and rich households. And so what we did, the first step of our study was to show that people are really good at detecting income when you show pictures of people's household. So imagine you're based in Portugal. I could show you a bunch of images of households taken in China and ask you to rank them according to the one that's most wealthy and least wealthy. And you'll be really good at doing that. You'll be way better than chance. And you would have a really good correlation between your reported ranking and the household's actual ranking. And so and it would work whether I showed you images from Portuguese household, but also Chinese household or Nigerian households, etc. So this was
And let me just add, and I think if I remember correctly, because I talked with people from Gapminder about this, they found that across the world, households who are of the same socioeconomic level, let's say, tend to be similar, right? In terms
Indeed.
of the utensils they have and all of that.
Indeed, and that kind of goes into the same vein of the
Right.
pyramid of need logic, whereas like if you don't have a lot of resources, you're going to focus on certain types of items in your house. You're probably going to, well, first want to have a few walls, maybe one room, some kind of makeshift beds, some form of cooking utensils, etc. And then as you have more and more resources, you'll start diversifying a little bit, and you'll start acquiring new things. And then when you have way more resources, maybe you'll have a flat screen TV and all these different things. But there's kind of the order of things
Yeah.
that we buy seems to be universal. So that if you take one rung on the ladder, one socioeconomic rung, you will find very similar households all across the world. So in the study, we first show that people are really good at detecting wealth in households. They way better at detecting wealth than, for example, the country of origin. So I can show you all these images. You'll be good at saying this one is the rich one, this is the poor one. But if I ask you which one is the one from China and which one is the one from, I don't know, India, that will be much harder. And it kind of makes sense because there are not that many things that are very specific to a country. Like whether you live in China or in India, if you have a lot of money, you'll have the same objects. And if you don't have a lot of money, you'll also have the same objects. Anyway, and so that was the first step of the experiment. In the second step, we asked another set of participants they each saw only one picture of a household. And we asked them to imagine someone who has lived there all their life and to rank that individual on a number of traits related to trustworthiness. So how reliable is this person? How likely are they to return a sum of money? How likely are they to help or like to cheat on their coworkers or all these different things? And crucially, a participant only sees one image, so they don't know that we're varying the income in the image. But what we see is that there's a strong correlation between perceived trustworthiness and the income of this household. So because we have data on what's the actual income of the pictures that we're showing. And so inhabitants of richer households are perceived to be more trustworthy, to have more self-control, to display more self-control behaviors than inhabitants of poorer households. And we replicated this in different populations. So we had participants from the UK, so or more from like a developed higher SES situation, but we also recruited participants from DRC, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the eastern region in Goma. So these participants all live in very deprived conditions compared to UK participants. They might not have, most of them don't have like a proper or like a house made out of bricks. They don't have their separate rooms, etc. And what was interesting is that we observed the same relationship between perceived trustworthiness and income within this population. And so this seems to suggest, and right now we're in the process of replicating this in even more countries, but so this seems to suggest that there's something kind of more or less universal about the stereotypes that we have on people's wealth.
Okay, so since I mentioned the Lida Cosmides and Michael Bank-Peterson paper, how would you square that off? I mean, since they have that paper, which at least to some extent I think suggests that the ideas people have or the stereotypes people have about low SES people might be cultural and with the research you've done there, what would you do?
Yeah, how would I bridge these two or like
yes,
fit together?
exactly.
I think that's a really good reason, and I think that as of now, I don't have the perfect answer. We need further studies, but one thing is that so in the crowding out culture article, what they're looking at is more as like what is people's belief about the reasons behind poverty. Is it because are people poor? Again, I'm simplifying a bit and using like this language that's a bit simplified, but
Yeah.
is poverty because people are lazy, or is poverty because people are unlucky? And so that's kind of like the causes of poverty. What we're observing or what we're measuring is kind of different. It's not like the reasons why people are poor, but like what kind of intuitions do people have if they're confronted to something poor. And so, for example, in the case of Denmark, it might very well be the case that you think that people are have a low socioeconomic status because they were unlucky, and so you're willing to redistribute. But it might still mean that you wouldn't, leave your computer unattended in a neighborhood where people are poorer. Like these are two different things.
Okay.
And so what we don't measure in our study on the stereotypes is like we don't know whether people think that inhabitants of poor households are less trustworthy because they were untrustworthy, they became poor, or if poverty made them untrustworthy, etc. We don't really know how these beliefs are formed. And so we would need further research to kind of be able to disentangle different mechanisms.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that it would make sense also for people to have both beliefs at the same time. I mean, for on the one hand, believe that yes, people are poor because of the bad circumstances they were brought up in, and at the same time, because they are poor, they have, for example, low self-control, and even knowing that supporting social programs because
Yeah.
they know they come from those circumstances.
These are compatible. I think one important point to note here again is that it's the study I'm running is on perceived self-control and perceived trustworthiness,
Yeah.
which has nothing to do with people's actual behavior. So it doesn't mean
Right.
that it's not because we're holding a certain perception that it's true for everyone, etc. Like you obviously know this, but I rather say it again because it's important to be precise in what we're studying.
No, of course. And talking about perceptions, you've also done some work on perceived morbidity and mortality risks associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. So, how did people form those perceptions?
Sure. So I feel like I'm like every single researcher in 2020. I was like, I need a COVID paper. So we did a COVID study with some co-authors. And so what we were interested in, again, is kind of, again, this framework that your environment will shape your psychology and behavior. And in this case of COVID, what was really interesting is that there was kind of this exogenous shock in people's environment where all of a sudden mortality and morbidity is higher. And then obviously economic hardship might also be higher, and this may affect people's behavior or people's psychology. And so kind of the first question we asked in this paper is like, how do people form perception of morbidity and mortality? Like, how are people afraid of dying of COVID or not, and why is that? And how do they form these beliefs? And so we had all this great data collected in France in a sample of 5,000 individuals, representative of in terms of age, socioeconomic status, gender, etc. And we asked them how worried they were about getting infected with COVID, getting sick because of COVID, and dying because of COVID. And so we had this for all the people, and we also had actual data about the prevalence of COVID at the time where people answered the survey. And so prevalence of COVID in their region or in the like very local area. And so what we saw is that people's risk perception, or like people's perception of the risk of becoming sick, etc., was actually very well correlated with the prevalence of COVID where they lived. And it was also correlated to some demographic variable. For example, if your health workers were more worried of getting sick with COVID than non-health workers, which makes sense in many ways. We also saw that people who worked outside of their homes versus people who were confined at home were more likely or like perceived higher risk of becoming sick or dying of COVID, which also makes sense. There were some other results that made a little less sense. For example, older individuals tended to be less worried about becoming sick, although we know that they were more susceptible to become sick of COVID. So this was a bit more surprising, but it might have to do with information regimes of people. Maybe they consume less information about COVID, etc.
And another question related to that. Did people's perceived morbidity and mortality risks affect in any way their risk-taking and patience? And if so, how did that manifest?
Sure. So the second step of the study was like, how does this perceived risk affect psychological trait like risk-taking in patients? And obviously we could not simply correlate these two, because there's a lot of confounding factor. Like if you're, let's say, a very anxious person, you might report a very high level of perceived risk. You might be like, oh, it's very likely that I die, etc. And then be very low in risk taking because you're very cautious, etc. And so you would find a strong negative correlation between these two. But this is actually going through. It's because you're a very anxious person. It's not really the impact of the likelihood of dying or the likelihood of getting sick on your behavior. Yeah. And so to kind of take into account this endogeneity problem, we use this econometric approach called the instrumental variable approach, where we controlled perceived risk for the actual prevalence of risk in people's region. And what we did find is that higher morbidity and mortality risk led to less risk-taking in terms of variance. So when you ask people, like, would you like this sure amount of money or this lottery, people who perceived a higher chance of getting sick or dying were more likely to say that they wanted a sure amount of money rather to take a gamble. And so we found that. We also had a similar question for patients. The finding was not as clear. We thought that people who were exposed to higher levels of risk would be more impatient. They would want the resources right now rather than wait a few weeks. This worked for a certain level of risk, but not for all participants. And so we couldn't have like a good conclusion for this question.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you also about some of the work you've been doing on climate change, but before that, just one more topic. So what is the belief-action gap?
Sure. So the belief-action gap is this very well-known phenomenon in psychology whereby people hold a certain belief. For example, I want to get healthy, or I think that being in good shape is important. And then their actions don't really correspond to that belief. The example I always love to use is kind of the New Year's Eve resolution, where you have these intentions to get healthy, to eat better, drink less, go to the gym, etc. And then the behavior doesn't always match your intentions. And so this is a very well-known phenomenon, and we've studied it in the context of climate change, where today, from the vast majority of people around the world, climate change is a very important issue. Most people agree with the fact that governments are not doing enough to solve climate change, that we should be doing more. And most people are willing to change their behavior for climate change. But at the same time, when you look at people's actual behavior, whether it's their related to their individual carbon footprint or their more systemic behavior, like their voting behavior or whatever, it seems to not exactly correspond to those intentions.
And so, I mean, what are the factors that hinder general beliefs from translating into actual behavior then?
So we've explored in this chapter that I co-authored with a number of people from my lab, including Aurore Grandin, who was the lead author in this chapter. We looked at some factors such as the fact that this might just be a kind of a measurement problem, that when we ask about beliefs or intentions, it's kind of a more general construct, and then when we ask about actions, it's like a subdomain, and so these two might not be very correlated, but it's more about how we measure this belief-action gap. And so if we had broader measures of behavior, we might observe less of a gap between these two. So that's obviously one reason why there might be this intention-action gap. Another reason is simply structural barriers. You might really want to change your behavior. You might really want to take a bike to go to work. But if you live in an area where there's no bicycle paths, or maybe there's no public transportation, etc., you have to take your car and you don't really have a choice. So there's just some structural factors that keep people from adopting the behavior that corresponds to their intention. Mm-hmm. But then if we go into more psychological factors that can be an obstacle or that can explain this belief-action gap, there's a whole range of them. One of them can be information deficits. You might not be aware that the behavior that you're engaging with is detrimental for the environment. If we go back to this on the environment, although some studies have shown that people have a pretty good idea of what's the carbon footprint of different types of food, people often underestimate the magnitude of the differences in carbon footprints. If you ask them, like, which one is better, like, people don't realize that meat can emit 10 to 20 times more emission than the same amount of protein in the form of vegetables. Mm-hmm. And so this lack of information on the impact of people's behavior can also explain this belief-action gap. Mm-hmm. There are also issues related to the fact that even if you have intentions for the environment, you also have a lot of other intentions and ambitions. And so you might have a conflict between, for example, your intention to lower your carbon footprint, and then maybe your intention to be a good parent. And maybe some of the parenting decisions you have to make have a very big environmental footprint, but there's a conflict between your different goals. And so this can also explain this belief-action gap. And then finally, and this is where most of my work comes in, there's also all the work related to our social cognition and the fact that our behavior is influenced not just by our intentions, our belief, but is also influenced by the behaviors of others and what we see around us. And so we might be less likely to adopt a behavior if others have themselves not adopted that behavior.
So with all of that in mind, I mean, there's this common idea that whenever you perceive a belief-action gap, it is a form of irrationality. But I mean, it is not necessarily so, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like this is something that's quite common to a lot of people who have a behavioral ecology approach to behavior, is that we don't like to think of behaviors ever being irrational. We have the saying in this life, it's like, if you think it's irrational, it's you haven't looked hard enough for the true reason, you know? And often people have, maybe not in their conscious awareness, but often people have very good reasons, or again, like a contextually rational reason for their behavior. And so if you see this belief-action gap, this might not be a failure of people's rationality to act on their beliefs, but it might just be caused by some other factor in the environment that's keeping people from doing this. For example, social influence, where maybe you want to save the planet, but if no one is doing it, well, it's hard to be motivated by it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, I have to say that I'm not a behavioral ecologist, but talking with behavioral ecologists and other people, particularly the anthropologists, over the years it has become harder and harder for me to really label any kind of behavior as irrational, because I'm always looking for some plausible or rational reason why people would behave or believe whatever it is. So
I think that's good, and the reason why I think it's important to have this approach is that if you just qualify a behavior as irrational, then it takes away a lot of tools to understand this behavior. Because if something is irrational, then it could be anything, right? Like it's hard to understand what's the cause of it because it's irrational, what's the function of it because it's irrational, etc. And so it kind of limits your understanding. Whereas if you start from the premise that there's again a contextually adaptive reason for this behavior, then you can use all these other tools to understand what function is this behavior fulfilling, and so what shape this behavior might have. And so I think that this is really good, and that's why I think that we should, as psychologists, as cognitive scientists, we should try to avoid using the word irrational as most as we can. And we should also, another word that I try to avoid using is the word bias, which I think is kind of similar, where we tend to see like, oh, the optimism bias and these the anchoring bias and this bias and this bias, and then kind of always suggest that there's a norm of the behavior and then we deviate from this norm. And again, it's kind of like an irrational behavior when you use the word bias. Whereas I think that biases often evolve for like very specific reasons, and they can serve a purpose that might not be adaptive in every single situation, but that on average provide a better outcome. And so again, I try to, in the same way I avoid irrational, I avoid the word bias.
Right. I mean, the way I tend to think about it is that, I think the same way for other words or expressions like stupid or evil or bad, because I mean, for the rational/irrational behaviors, it took me longer to really understand that perhaps I shouldn't be using the word irrational as often as I used to. But when it comes to labeling people or behaviors as stupid or evil and so on, for a longer time I thought that it wouldn't make much sense to do that, because if you say that something is stupid or evil or bad, then the explanation ends there, right? And you're not looking for further factors, for example, to understand why people in fact behave in ways that are considered normatively stupid or evil or whatever, right?
Exactly. I feel that as scientists, we have our job is really to understand behavior, and so we should use tools that help us understand better, and then leave the moral judgment for other contexts. Obviously, we all have moral judgments at all times where we're humans, but in the context of research, I think it's important the vocabulary we choose kind of reflects what approach we choose, and so I think it's better to have an approach that's, takes into account the context again.
Yeah, a non-judgmental approach, I guess. So, focusing now on climate change, we've already talked a little bit about it, but tell us about the social dilemma of climate change, because one of the issues with tackling it is that the benefits, if we have them, are expected to be shared collectively, but many of the costs are private. Right.
Indeed. So this concept was popularized by Gardner, that published this article, "The Tragedy of the Commons," that was very famous, and that kind of stated, well, when we're all sharing a common, because it's no individual person's responsibility to kind of save this resource or whatever, we're all going to overexploit it, and this will lead to collapse. Obviously, there's been a lot of response to this approach. Elinor Ostrom being kind of one of the leaders to say that there's not necessarily a tragedy of the commons, that we can escape it. But the idea is that indeed climate change is a social dilemma, is a tragedy of the commons situation, because the efforts are private. The effort I'm going to do to solve climate change is private. If I reduce my energy consumption, if I reduce the traveling I do, etc., I'm paying the private cost for this, but the benefits are common. So if I do all these things, I'm not going to save my own little environment over my head, unfortunately. It will depend on the behavior of everybody else. Yeah. And so this is why, because of this interdependence in the outcome, this calls into action our social cognition. This is a social problem in many, many different ways. And so to navigate the social problem, we're going to rely on mechanisms that kind of regulate cooperation. So we're going to rely on our fairness or like our norm detection mechanism, on our reputation management mechanism, and our fairness mechanisms.
And tell us then about those three mechanisms. I mean, why are they important and why might they be sometimes obstacles to environmental policies?
Sure. So if we start with social norms, or ability to detect a social norm, is very useful to answer the question like when or who is cooperating and when should I cooperate. And so there's been a very vast literature showing the influence of social norm on behavior. One of my favorite one is this paper done by a team in Netherlands called The Spread of Disorder. I don't know if you're familiar with this paper, but basically
No.
in this study, scientists went in this little street, I think it was in Amsterdam, and put a bunch of leaflets on people's bicycles. And then in one condition, they left those leaflets and that was it. And then the other conditions, they did a lot of graffitis on the wall.
Oh,
And there
wait a
was a
minute.
sign like no
I'm
graffiti,
remembering this study, but I couldn't remember the
the
title
name of
or
the.
associated with the title. Yeah.
Yeah, and so basically it's like this very classical finding that if a social norm has been broken, like here, if there's like a lot of graffiti on the wall, even though there's a no graffiti sign, people are more likely to throw their leaflet on the ground instead of walking all the way to the end of the street to put it in the garbage. And so you have countless studies showing the importance of these social norms, that we're more likely to engage in a virtuous behavior if other people are doing it, and we kind of tend to conform our behavior to the norm. And so
It,
why is
it's sort of associated with that broken windows effect or something
yeah,
like
it
that.
has been, this kind of study has been used to justify these like the broken window policy, that you have to make sure that that there's no social norm that has been violated, because if one
Yeah.
is violated, it will encourage, or not encourage, it will motivate people to violate other norms, etc. And so, why can social norm detection be sometimes an obstacle for environmental action? Well, simply because of two things. First, sometimes when people adopt a virtuous behavior for the environment, a lot of these behaviors are invisible. For example, if you, Ricardo, you decided to never take a plane again, unless you tattooed that on your forehead, it would be very hard for me to know. Because kind of by definition, all behaviors of omission, like no longer taking a plane, no longer doing this, it's invisible, almost by definition. And so because of this, it's going to be very hard for for the social norm to spread, because it's hard to witness, it's hard to see. And so making, in this sort of situation, making virtuous social norms more visible can be helpful to kind of stabilize their norm, to make sure that everybody is aware of it and can adopt it. Now, this is when the virtuous behavior is already the norm, but it's just that it's invisible.
Right.
Now, there's another situation for the environment, is that we need to go from a situation where no one has adopted the virtuous behavior to a situation where everybody has adopted it.
Yeah.
And so how do you go from one state to the other? Because again, we tend to conform to the norm. So if everybody is eating a lot of steaks and having a guzzling car, well, I'm just going to do the same. And so here, there are some studies that have shown that what can be useful in this situation is to use dynamic norms, whereby you're not telling the total share of people who adopted a behavior, because that's not going to be very motivating. If I tell you 10% of the French population is vegetarian, you might not tell yourself, oh, I have to become a vegetarian now. But if I tell you the number of vegetarians in France has doubled over the past 2 years, that might be way more motivating, because you're communicating on a dynamic norm, which shows a few things. First, it shows that people are able to change their behavior, because if it doubled, it means that people who were not doing something are not doing it. So it might give you information about the cost of switching. Well, if others has done it, maybe I can do it too. And it kind of gives you indications about the direction of this norm. So you might think, well, I don't want to be left behind. I also want to adopt this behavior. And so this is why, in the context of climate change, of sustainability in general, we need to make positive norms more visible, and we need to rely on dynamic norms to try to create a positive social movement.
So, okay, so about that, one last question then. So, do you think or do you know if people, governments across the world and cross-national and international institutions are paying attention to the psychological literature when it comes to trying to mitigate the effects or the potential effects of climate change? Because just recently a new report from the IPCC came out and it's very dire as usual, I guess. So do you think that people are paying attention to this? Because I would imagine that if they aren't, then we shouldn't really expect people to change their behavior that much, right?
I think that's a really good point you're making. Actually, if you go back to the IPCC now, so you have three aspects to the IPCC reports. The first one is really on the cause and or like on measuring climate change, how it works. The second is on like the human impact, quantifying the impact of every sector, and then the third type is on the solutions that we can put in place of either adaptation or mitigation. And on this last on the solution side, there's been a lot of change in the scientists that are involved in this panel. Where it used to be more like very technical, like we can do nuclear fusion or geoengineering or like tax policies, etc.
Yeah, perhaps more engineers and climate scientists and people
Exactly.
like that.
And now, and today you have more and more, you have a lot of economists who are like really working on the policy side and all these things, but you have more and more psychologists and climate and cognitive scientists that are also advising and saying like, hey, if you want to convince people, this is what you should take into account. And so, for example, one of the big changes is that fairness has been recognized as something very important for mitigation measures. And so in the IPCC report, it is stated in writing that policies to mitigate climate change should take into account fairness to be adopted by the population. And so this is one of the examples of how this research is maybe, get it trickling through governments and influencing policy. I think there's still it's still not perfect. More should be done. But thankfully, there are these great research centers that have a mission of disseminating the science as well.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you about that because over these past 5+ years, of course, I've been talking with lots of different social scientists, psychologists, and anthropologists in particular. And I mean, sometimes it's really sad to see how people think about and deal with social scientists. I mean, sometimes they have a bit of disdain toward them because, oh, it's like soft science. But in fact, if you look into it closely, many times it has, or would have, if there were, for example, if there was more investment in it, some very interesting and good applications, right, for society, politics, and so on.
I often like to think we have this distinction between like hard science and soft science. And I sometimes want to call social science the really hard science because you can't control for any of the parameters and it's way messier. And so doing science in this context on living humans that live in these very complex contexts, it's much harder than to, in a way, than to isolate the behavior of particles that you can have a lot of control over. But I think that depending on who you talk to, obviously, but I think that this is changing, and this is something that we've seen in France with the creation of a sort of behavioral policy unit in government that's using research to improve public policies, for example, through administrative simplification or doing better environmental policies, etc. This has also been very popular in the UK with the famous behavioral insights team, etc. So I think that slowly we're seeing this approach being more more and more popular.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you mentioned there, that doing social science many times it's even harder than the science people are doing in the so-called art sciences, just reminded me of. I was once listening to a talk by Robert Kelly, an anthropologist, and he was saying that he had a friend who was actually a rocket scientist, and he told him that what he was doing as an anthropologist was much harder than what he was doing in terms of physics and all of that, because in fact there are many hard factors to control when it comes to people's behavior, right?
Indeed. Indeed, for someone like me studying the effect of wealth and poverty, it's like I can't really run like a big experiment where I vary all these parameters externally, because that would be unethical and very costly. And so we have to rely on alternative techniques to do that. So yeah, it does make it harder to study.
Great. So, Melusine, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. So I think the best way to find my research would simply be on Google Scholar to look for Mélusine Boon-Falleur. I'm looking the way to have a name that's unique enough that I am proud to say I am the only person in the world with this name. So I'm very findable on Google Scholars and other websites. And I also have my personal academic website, which is just melusinebf.com, where I try to keep it up to date and put my research on there too.
Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. I really love the work you've been doing, and keep up with it. And hopefully somewhere in the future, I will have you back on the show.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great pleasure to answer all of your well thought questions, and it was really fun. So thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Pererga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Denbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Saim Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.